Hello, Rabotat fam. Welcome to Rabotat Radio, episode number 3. Is this a German 3 or is this a British 3?
3 Gläser.
Welcome, everyone. We are here today doing a Stephen King episode. After our trip to Maine this past go-around in May, we're uniquely positioned to talk about Stephen King just a little bit more because we exposed ourselves to Bangor, Maine.
We did. We saw where the man wrote all of his amazing movies and his books.
Yeah, the good combination of a lot of that stuff. Because Stephen King was actually, for those of you who don't know, born and raised in Maine. Shout out to Maine, wearing my Bull Moose sweatshirt right now. What? No plug, just there.
She also didn't mention this. She's from Maine.
I'm from Maine.
So when I first met Alex, the first movie we saw in theaters in Spain was the Carrie remake.
Oh my god. It
was terrible.
Pretty bad. The one that came out, 2013, 2014?
Yeah. But then I've asked her, since we started dating, how many Stephen King books have you read?
Yeah.
And she's read 15, 20.
You almost can tell by looking at our book collection how many books from his I've read, because at this point we've accumulated a bunch of them. There's going to be a couple shout outs to some books later that I just wanted to make mention of if you wanted to pick up a really good Stephen King book, something I personally would recommend. A couple years ago, Iron Fist Nick over here actually got me a couple first editions, and there might be one or two of them making appearance tonight. So it's pretty crazy. Actually, there's one here and one here. We got Gerald's Game and Christine are two of the ones that you got.
Oh, there you go. Here. I got my Federal Jacks from Kennebunkport, Maine.
Nice.
I got that cup.
Rocking a lot of Maine
swag. We're not sponsored, but we thought we'd bring Maine in hard. So, cheers.
And I just have a Golden Girls cup. So, cheers.
Thank you for being a friend.
Going back to the Waterboro Public Library, I used to probably take out a book a week, maybe 2 books a week for Stephen King.
Yeah.
And you could just spend endless amounts of time, and you could find almost anything that you want up there. Finding out that you had this big personality in the state. So he himself was born in Portland, Maine. I can't tell you what year he was born. He himself. That was terrible. He's kind of been around the area his whole life, but born and raised Mainer. Also met Tabitha King there at the UMaine Orono Public Library, or their campus library, actually. So really, really amazing, kind of like, again, like this storied Maine thing. And so what's crazy is he wrote this whole time he was writing. And he would make a little money here and there, but nothing really substantial. And so he actually had written Carrie and threw it away.
Oh, wow,
and
really?
And just was like, I'm done. Like, he was frustrated with writing, all this stuff. And Tabitha actually pulled Carrie out of the trash and was like, you need to release this because this is really good. And they would end up going and publishing Carrie, and that would be his first big book. And that would actually get him to the point where he didn't have to work a normal day job. He could officially go and write and be Stephen King.
I was going to ask, are you sure it wasn't the Carrie remake that he threw in the trash?
Why not? We ended up taking a trip to Maine back in May, and in our time in Maine, we decided to go visit some Stephen King hotspots.
We did.
So we went specifically to Bangor, which I've actually never been to. So that was kind of an interesting experience just in general as a Mainer, like taking the trip up. It's kind of a drive from where my parents are at, which is 3 hours south of there. So we made our way up there and kind of spent a whole day in Bangor, Maine, doing the thing.
So we drove up in the evening, stayed the night. When we got up, we decided to go check out, really within 5 miles of us was the Paul Bunyan statue.
Mm-hmm. Here we are, everyone, over here with Paul Bunyan in Bangor, Maine. This was the inspiration for Stephen King, using it for It. It gave Richie Tozier a fright of his life. And we're here today seeing it in person, and it's massive. And also surrounded by a lot of hotels. So if you ever want to come to Bangor to see some stuff, you might want to stay at this Residence Inn Marriott, or this sick-ass Fireside Inn, or the Hollywood Casino Hotel. You got options here. So then after that, we ended up going into downtown Bangor. We actually putzed around and we ate at a place called Blaze. Shout out. The poutine there was amazing, and so were the mussels.
Yeah, seafood and poutine, and that's definitely poutine, just gravy, cheese curds, and French fries, maybe with some type of topping on top of it. And in Maine, they cook it in duck fat, so it's an extra, just like rich, sexy goodness.
We ended up making our way past that, and there's this really cool mural. So after we left the downtown Bangor area, that is when we ended up making our way over to where it all came true, guys. Mr. King's house here on 47 Broadway in Bangor, Maine. Kind of a spectacular little sight to be seen. And there's landscaping going on right now. And if you can't tell, that makes such a difference in this yard.
But then down the street, right down the street, within walking distance of this, I mean, everything, mind you, is pretty much in walking distance, except Stephen King's house is on the top of a hill, is a little sewer grate, which was the inspiration for It as well, in the very famous opening scene, opening probably a few chapters of the book, It.
We're here at the corner of Union and Jackson Street in Bangor, and this drain pipe inspired Stephen King to do some weird shit with It. Go figure, right?
It actually looks nothing like it does in the movie, or either of the movies for that matter, but it was still really interesting just to see these really common things being used in a really creative way and really just close right where he lives.
Yeah. And these things that just, again, everyday things that inspired him to make these very, very twisted, like bizarre stories. It's amazing. The guy was pretty disturbed to be looking at this stuff and think, Pennywise. Nah. From there, we actually did go to the furthest location in Bangor, which would end up being Mount Hope Cemetery, which is a lot of the inspiration behind Pet Sematary. And it also, Pet Sematary, the film, had some locations that were filmed at Mount Hope itself. Mount Hope Cemetery, where they filmed Pet Sematary by Stephen King, one of my personal favorite films. This was the exact cemetery where they filmed the scene where Missy Dandridge is buried. Somewhere in the midst of this massive, massive old cemetery is also potentially the inspiration for Carrie. There is a Carrie headstone that exists in this cemetery as well that we believe inspired Stephen King to write the book. But how can you not be inspired by this beautiful big place?
And so it was really cool for me to be able to go to that cemetery and kind of try to track that down with her, because it's cool. It's one of the oldest cemeteries in New England, right? Mm-hmm. Mount Hope Cemetery. Yeah. So really interesting there too. But it's also like a scavenger hunt because we weren't really sure where we were going. There wasn't like a specific location. Just kind of sure. And it was all kind of a feeling. But I think if you watch the movie at least 300 times in your lifetime, you have a good feeling about certain things. She did. Yeah. So I sensed it. We'll see how all that actually came out. On a side note, I do want to give a shout out to the documentary Unearthed and Untold: The Path to Pet Sematary. Oh yeah. That came out in 2015. If you want to watch a really amazing documentary about a film even being made, I think that a lot of the reason I also love this movie is you get the real Maine feel, and that's because most of it is truly filmed in Maine. Maine actors, Maine technicians, basically bringing in all their people from New England, but pretty much bringing a lot of economic stimulus to the state and doing a really cool thing, and you feel that when you watch it. So that in particular, just a shout out if you want to learn a little bit more about Pet Sematary and how it was made, and also just kind of see some of the spots that we went to. Honestly, if you've never read a Stephen King book or watched a Stephen King film, highly recommend it. Even for the non-horror fans, there's something for everybody. Well, what do you recommend? Do you have a reading list? I am so glad you asked. Give me a moment. Let me get my books. Da-da-da-da. So even though obviously we have things, this doesn't even touch it. Cut to our little standing bookshelf in the living room that has the whole lineup of Stephen King. This doesn't even touch it, but I have 3 books that I would highly recommend personally. I think that they all kind of cover different bases, but what I think ultimately
is this tie-in for all Stephen King stories, for me, that I notice, is that they're all human stories. So even though they're horror stories, and again, very rooted in somewhat all the Maine culture, I think all of these take place in Maine. Maybe not my Bachman choice, but you get that feel. And really, at the end of the day, they're just like drama stories, drama pieces that are disguised in horror. Okay. Classic. Cujo. I love Cujo. The book, heartbreaking. The movie, a little less heartbreaking, but also still pretty tragic. The crazy thing about Cujo is when Stephen King wrote the book, he actually doesn't remember writing the book because at the time he was kind of involved in a lot of heavy drugs, a lot of heavy drinking. But he talks about in interviews how he regrets not remembering writing this because it's such a good book. And I couldn't agree more. It's really a story about a small family kind of being divided apart by this kind of affair, and then what happens is just kind of like a everyday situation, and they run into this rabid dog. I don't want to explain it too much. I would recommend reading the book. I would recommend watching the movie. I'd probably recommend the movie first because, again, the huge change of the ending for Cujo in the story in the book than there is in the movie, and I think the movie might be a little bit more palatable for the everyday person. For number 2, and I brought 2 books here because I kind of wanted to show this off. It would be wrong of me not to pick what I picked for my first one. So my second choice is actually a Richard Bachman story called The Regulators. I don't think this one actually takes place in Maine. Oh. What I have to say about this, on a side note, Nick mentioned this earlier, but Richard Bachman is a side pseudonym of Stephen King. Basically, when he was having all this success and getting all this, garnering all this attention for his writing, he decided to come up with the Bachman character to see if he could still successfully release novels under that name and still make money. Turns out he could, which is amazing. But turns out for a really long time, you know, there was kind of those subtle bits of like Stephen King might be Richard Bachman, but it was never known in the lore. So what ended up happening is he released The Regulators on the same day that he would release his Stephen King book, Desperation. And so I'm going to show you what he basically did, and it's like a kind of a peekaboo, so...
Oh.
You see that?
Did they go the other way?
They go the other way. You can see when you put the covers together that they create one picture.
That's pretty sick.
It's really sick. Wow. And this was his little peekaboo way of being like, haha, like I'm Richard Bachman and I'm Stephen King.
You've read both of these?
I've read both of them.
These are freaking huge.
They're amazing. They're huge. They're also kind of, I would say, like a wild ride for what you would normally see with a Stephen King. And that says a lot because there are some crazy things that man has written. This book, though, The Regulators specifically, I read in a day. I don't normally do that with even some of the best. And so that says a lot about this. This was a fun read. Highly, highly recommend it. Desperation as well. It's just going to take you a little bit longer. So if you look at that, I mean, compared,
yeah, they're
big boys
for sure.
But highly recommend both of them. Regulators is one of my favorites. And then we get to the good.
Dreamcatcher.
I wish. Tommy Knockers. If you want to just sleep. No offense, Stephen King, but a lot of verbiage in that one. My favorite, again, should come to no surprise, is Pet Cemetery. And luckily, this is one of the first editions that you actually bought me a couple years ago, and the problem with it is that the cover is absolutely falling apart. Yep. But I think it says a lot, too, about the storied, beloved nature of Pet Cemetery. It's one of his top. Again, a human story, really, ultimately. It's about a small family relocating to Maine and moving in and basically going through the growing pains of coming into a community, but also the story itself is about loss, but it's also about isolation because these people move into this area that they're new to and then immediately go through a very big tragedy. Right. And so it's interesting because in a lot of ways, it's really pretty tragic, but it's also very scary when it cuts that corner and finally becomes like the horror story when you bring in, the burial ground and bringing people back from the dead. And it's fun. If you know me as well, I'm a big zombie girl, so Pet Cemetery does a lot of great things. Timmy Bateman in the story is also a shout out. There's a great short story we have somewhere in our bookshelf as well with Timmy Bateman in it. But zombie story, cool. Human story, Pet Cemetery, obviously iconic in my life and highly recommend. Thank you guys for joining us again for another episode of Rabotat Radio. I'm Madame Defer.
I'm Iron Fist.
And we will see you for the next episode. Cheers.
How embarrassing.
No, you know what would be more embarrassing? How many Stephen King books can I juggle? How many hardcovers can I juggle?
Don't juggle the first editions.